Hello, it's Rob Walker again. I'm not sure the world really needs this video, but I'm going to do it anyway. It's a deep dive into how the Clipstore macro is built and how it functions. Maybe it's useful for some people to learn a bit about how to put together more complicated macros. And more than anything, it just helps me remember exactly how this thing works. So, Clipstore, as we've seen, I trigger it. It goes and stores a clip on some tracks, and that's one run of the macro. Okay, so if we open up Keyboard Maestro editor, first of all, just to explain the layout, so we have two folders here, Clipstore 1, 2, 3, and versions in mono and stereo. So they're essentially identical, except one's built for mono tracks, the other's built for stereo tracks, but the procedure is essentially exactly the same with both of them. So we'll use the mono one for this demonstration. And inside the folder for Clipstore, there's actually 4 separate macros. Only one has a trigger. And this is the macro we're going to look at. The other ones are used for you to initial setup, which is the chooser macro, and also a slightly different macro if you fill up your tracks. It goes through a slightly different procedure to let you decide what you want to do, if you want to make more tracks or nominate some new ones. So they're just little helper macros. You don't need to ever trigger those yourself. They're all triggered from the main macro 2, 4, 8, 16. And this is a little separate utility which simply zeroes out the names of the tracks. So if you've already been running Clipstore for a while and you run into problems or you just want to reset and do your setup again, you can just run this macro from here, probably just by using the run button in Keyboard Maestro, and it'll just zero out the names of the tracks. So as you can see there, my tracks are dump st and unproc 1. So let's jump into the main macro. So this is the code for it. I mean, it's not really code. I'm not a coder. I don't pretend to be a coder. I've not been trained in it. It uses some basic programming principles, the main one being variables, which is basically a location in which you store some information. So if I call a variable Clipstore track name, for example, I can use that to store the text for track names. And then I can access that memory location at any point that I want. And those variables, those little memory locations, are important for Clipstore, and they're retained permanently by Keyboard Maestro so that when you return to a session 6 months later, the track name of your Clipstore track is still the same. But variables have a lot of uses when you get into more complicated macros and are a kind of staple of coding and programming. So we'll just go through the actions. So these are just for information, these ones in green. Go and buy my wonderful sound effects from robwalkersoundeffects.com while you're here. You can also get in touch on email. The cat's just arrived, so you might hear some meowing or not. And this is just a note to say the other Clipstore macros are needed, so don't delete them. And a little note about how automation works, which I've explained in another video, but basically we don't copy-paste automation in Clipstore. We only copy-paste the clip. And the next one is a little setup, which again I've talked about in another video. You need to set up a shortcut for rename tracks in Pro Tools. So let's get into the actual actions. So first of all, activate Pro Tools. That simply makes sure that if you're in another application, that Pro Tools is at the front and is the main application. There's a little thing here, which is a little bug I found with Altiverb 7, which is if you have the Altiverb IR browser open, Clipstore doesn't work because the Altiverb IR browser keeps pulling focus back to itself, which is a little bit irritating. So that's just a little bug fix for Altiverb 7. I don't think it applies in 8, so don't worry about that. It's not going to slow anything down. Next, bring window with name containing edit to the front. So that just ensures that if you have a plugin open, the window can be focused. So at the moment, Altiverb is focused in this case, and the edit window is not focused. It's not showing the green, amber, and red lights. So the first thing we have to do is pull focus back to the edit window in case someone has been using a plugin and then suddenly decides they want to trigger Clipstore. So bring focus back to the edit window. And we use this action with the title containing edit because in Pro Tools, the name of the edit window changes with every session. So the actual underlying user interface title of this particular edit window is edit : Clipstore demo. So we search for a window containing the title edit and then the colon in Pro Tools. So the next thing we do is we set a variable called Clipstore starting track to blank, basically. So that clears it out. It means that we're starting with a clean slate, and the Clipstore starting track is wherever you are with your selection. So in this case, VO2, and what we're going to do is we're going to store that track name VO2 in a variable called Clipstore starting track. And that's so that we can access that value later. So first of all, we clear it. So from the last run, we want it empty. And then next thing that we do is we have a thing called a semaphore lock. And a semaphore lock is just a way of preventing multiple versions of the same macro from running or from the same macro family. So in this case, we only ever want to have one instance of Clipstore running. We don't want to have the mono and then someone mistakenly triggers it twice or triggers the mono and halfway through triggers the stereo. That's going to cause a lot of problems. So we use this thing called a semaphore lock, which is a Keyboard Maestro thing. And all you have to do is name it something. You can call it whatever you want. And then any other macros that you don't want to run, you just put the same instruction in, lock the semaphore named Clipstore 24816, and they basically become like an exclusive. So only one of those can run at any one time. And also once this macro is running, then this macro cannot be launched on top of itself. When the macro stops running, it releases that semaphore, as it's called, and then it can be run again. So this is something that I put into most of the macros that I make, just to make sure that you don't run multiple instances, which then can cause terrible problems. Okay, so that's just a bit of setup. Then we get into the actual manipulation of Pro Tools. So the first thing we have done is we've already created a shortcut for the rename tracks command. And what we're doing is we're using that to store the name of the track we're on. So rename tracks in Pro Tools, which I've assigned to Control Option R, and that brings up the rename track dialog. Crucially, this is how we can now copy with Command C, and this is what the macro does, the track name that we're on. Okay. And then we cancel because we don't want to rename the track, we just want to grab its name. Okay, so those little things I've just done there are these instructions here. So we rename tracks. This little pause condition here, it just pauses in case that window is a bit sluggish opening, because sometimes if you put in too many keystrokes, the macro can run faster than the Pro Tools user interface can respond. So you sometimes have to put in little pauses just to allow it time to breathe. So this is saying pause until the front application does not contain the name edit. So when we're here, the window of the front application does contain the name edit. When we hit Command R, it does not. So now the front window is called VO2. And then it says pause until the front window does not contain edit. And then we hit escape once we've captured that. So that pause just gives it a chance to to make sure the window is open before it then copies the track name, which is the Command C. And then what we do is we set a new variable called, we set the same variable, Clipstore starting track, to be the system clipboard. So whatever was copied in this action here, the Command C. So now the system clipboard has dumped its value into our variable called Clipstore starting track. So now Clipstore starting track matches VO2. And as you see there, it indicates that it will be VO2. Then we tell it to hit escape, which closes that rename window. Then we have another little conditional pause, which is just don't do anything until the Pro Tools window does contain edit again, which just ensures that that window is closed. In terms of speed, it's not going to affect the speed, but if you've got a sluggish session, it might just help out a little bit. Okay, now we have to do some checks. And what these checks do are they make sure that the user has nominated Clipstore tracks. So the first time that you run this macro, when you get to this point, it's going to check whether you've already nominated Clipstore tracks. If you haven't, then it's going to run the chooser macro, which is one of our side macros here. So at this point, you will go into the setup macros, let's call them. So either it's empty, or on a previous run of the macro, it was not classified as a valid track name. So a valid track name would be a track name that exists in the current session. So if either of those things are the case, it will run the setup again. So that stops it trying to paste onto tracks that don't exist. Now the next check it has to do is it has to check if the Clipstore tracks are full up. And again, we have a variable for that, which is set in the setup of the chooser macros. And if the tracks are full, then again, it will run a different chooser, which allows you to decide whether you want to create more tracks or nominate new tracks. But it stops the macro from going any further. So if the tracks are full, then it's not going to allow any pasting. So that's why we have a cancel just this macro action here. So let's assume we've passed those two checks and we've got valid nominated tracks which do exist in the session and they're not full. So then we have a little pause for a tiny amount, and that's just to give us a breather between escape and another check, which is to make sure that automation follows edit is off. So that will check the status of this automation follows edit in Pro Tools, and it will switch it off if it's on. And that's because the paste behavior we need for this to work properly is to have that off. And we'll switch that back on again at the end. So now we search for the actual track which has been nominated by the user. So if they've just arrived here from a chooser macro, then it will search for that track. So that's Command Option F, which is scroll to track. It will delete, it will clear and delete any existing typing. That also helps in case the user has left their keys, fingers on the keys. And then it will paste the track name in. So we go Command Option F, the macro selects and clears any erroneous typing, and then it pastes in the name of your track, your nominated Clipstore track, which in my case is unproc1, and then it will hit enter. So we'll go back up to the top and we'll go back into our macro. So if you've come from a chooser macro, so it's the first time you're running it, it's going to search for that track name before carrying on. However, in normal operation, what it's going to do is do a copy. So it's actually now going to copy the audio. So we now have the audio in our buffer. Then it's going to scroll to the track. Then it's going to clear it, any erroneous typing. And then it's going to paste the track name in. Very tiny pause. Maybe you need to increase that on a sluggish session or a slow system. And then you hit return. So it's going to scroll to our track. If, however, it's been unable to find that track, we have an Apple script here, which will close the scroll to track window and again run the chooser to say, I can't find the track in this session. So all of these things are just making sure that we have a valid track. Now, we actually get to where it's going to paste. So we have the 8-track version. We also have the 16-track version, the 4-track, and the 2. They're all essentially the same thing, so I'll just show you the 8-track version because that's the one I use most. And what it does is it says, okay, if the user has selected 8 Clipstore tracks, which I have in my setup, first of all, it makes sure that the scroll to track pop-up is closed. And then at this point, it's already arrived on the correct track. So our actions have already taken us to unproc 1. And this is unproc 1. This is my Clipstore track. And as you can see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 of them are already full. But it's arrived on the first one. So we're on the first track. And what it does is it checks the condition of fades in Pro Tools. So the way that this works is, depending on where your cursor is, your selection, you'll have different options in the fades menu here as to what you can, whether you can apply fades or not. So here I'm in a blank space, so the fades options don't exist. There's nothing to fade. However, if I'm overlapping inside of a clip, then fades, I can create a fade from the start or to the end. Those options are available. If I'm over the top of a whole clip, then I have the create fades option available. So we can use the logic of how Pro Tools decides whether you can make fades of different types or not to analyze whether the track is clear for you to be able to paste into. And this basic logic is how Clipstore works. So we're on the first track, and in the first track we have an option to create fades. So that tells us we're over some audio. If we were not over some audio, then we would not have an option to create fades. It wouldn't exist. And if we were inside the clip, then we would have an option to create fade to start or fade to end. Okay, so what the routine does is it says if the ability to make a fade is enabled, so it's possible to make a fade, or the option to make a fade to the start is enabled, then go down by 1 track. So this keystroke, the semicolon, is going to take you down by 1 track. And then you pause for a very tiny amount of time. We're here. We go down 1 track and we analyze again. So we've gone down 1 track and we run the same analysis, which is this one. And it will keep running those analysis until it finds an empty track. And it will run it 7 times. So because we've nominated 8 tracks, we can go down 7 tracks to try and find an empty track. So if the condition does not exist, so if neither of those fades are possible, then that tells Keyboard Maestro that we're on an empty track, and we can finally do a paste. So we do a paste like So it's now successfully pasted its audio, and it's ready to return. So it's pausing. I'm learning myself again. It's pausing until the ability to create fades does exist again. And that will only exist when the paste has been done successfully. So when it was empty, we've done our paste, and now this will apply. So it pauses until the paste is finished. So this is how it's checking how the paste is finished. And then we do our scroll to track. And we're going to insert the name of the starting track. And this is what we grabbed earlier to take us back to the top. We hit return. And then we switch automation follows edit back on. And then we end a macro. And that's one run of Clipstore. So every time you activate the macro, it does all of that stuff there. And don't worry, it will switch that back on itself when it's run properly. So we'll just go through it again. Trigger the macro. And we're back to the top. Okay, I'm going to end the video there. If you've got any questions, please feel free to ask away. Send me an email. Always happy to try and help people out. I don't pretend to be an expert on this stuff. I've just taught myself by basically banging my head against problems until I find a way to solve them.